Frequency matters. Frequency matters. Hello, and welcome to the Frequency Matters podcast. Blessings to you wherever you are in the world. I'm Kim Fendi, your host. Today we have Dr. Mauro Zapaterra. He obtained his MD and PhD from Harvard Medical School. He is board certified in physical medicine and rehabilitation with a focus on optimizing human performance, increasing awareness, and decreasing suffering. He's been practicing mindfulness since 1998 and teaching mindfulness to patients with chronic pain since 2018. He has led the Awakening Awareness Program for the Emerging Sciences Foundation, which can all be found on YouTube for free. He has published numerous scientific papers and medical book chapters on the cerebrospinal fluid, disability, and pain management. He has also published I Am, All One, and All Love, which are books exploring topics of awareness primarily for kids, but really for people of all ages. He has also published Close Your Eyes, What Do You See? With his son, which is a story about imagination and intention. And this is Dr. Mauro Zapaterra. I'm Kim Fendi. I am a sound healer based out of Cincinnati, and I am really interested in exploring the fascinating work that's being done around the world in the field of sound and light frequencies and the impact on the human body.
Cool.
So I'm excited to hear what you've got to say. I know you've done a lot of really fascinating work in your field. So if you just want to just kick it off, and wherever that kind of prompt takes you, we'll just go ahead and flow with the conversation.
Yeah, so it could take us anywhere, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Sound healing. Yeah, so a lot of the work that I do is with people. We do use sound healing to do some of that work. And I'm very interested in how sound and how frequency and vibrations or energy, let's just call it, what sort of energies we interact with, and how sound and light can help rebalance our own energy field based on whatever happens to us in our daily life, or even our thought patterning or our emotions or whatnot. And so I always kind of take it and think about it from if I walk into a sound wave, for instance, let's say there's drums are playing, Tibetan crystal bowls, but you obviously hear it. So there's sound that comes through. So there's an auditory component to it, and then you feel it from the physical level, but the sound is essentially, it's transmitting an energy wave, and we're interacting with that. And so I think the curious question is, can that sound wave interact with our own energy patterning? And does that sound wave, have a certain frequency to it that can help rebalance or, bring harmony or homeostasis to our own energy field? I think that's a very valid question to ask and to investigate. And I'm very interested in sort of like, well, how does that, if you were to, let's say, bathe yourself in a sound bath, and and people brought awareness to where they were feeling it in the body, right? Where would those places be? Or are there places where people are more aware of the sound, the frequency of the sound that's penetrating their body? Um, and where would those places be? And so I'm interested. I actually have a hypothesis that actually the sound comes in and it really interacts with our whole human system, but it interacts at our DNA level. It interacts at our cellular level, and holistically, it really interacts as well on the water level, like in on the fluid level of
Mm-hmm.
the body. You could bring in a bowl of water into a sound healing studio, and all of a sudden you can see the the resonance of the water forming, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if it has a certain frequency, you can actually see shapes and patterns that develop on that water. Or even if you did it, let's say on a metal surface with sand, or stuff like that.
Yeah.
um and so so I just kind of I'm just more interested and curious in those types of questions, to be honest with you, than have any like specific answers to them. We did propose a research study specifically looking at the cerebrospinal fluid, and it wasn't funded. Uh, but it's still something that we're sort of thinking about in terms of, I'm very interested in the cerebrospinal fluid, which is this fluid that bathes the inside of the brain, the outside of the brain, the spinal cord, the sacrum. It's sort of this central column of fluid that our brain and spine are essentially floating in, or buoyant in. And so, the question we had is, if you have somebody, if we played something, some instrument or some drum or some Tibetan bowl or crystal bowl or something like that on the outside, could we measure a change in the fluid dynamics in the cerebrospinal fluid? That was essentially our basic question.
Yeah.
Um, and people who are very sensitive to it would say, well, absolutely. Um, and so it's almost like pointless. But there's a lot of people out there who sort of like, it's like you need the hardcore research. So you need like the scientific proof, whatever
Right.
that means,
Right.
um, to like show that it really does. But what we've seen is that a lot of research has actually followed, the path of, hey, we're there's sensitive people out there who can, who have these perceptions, and then the research shows that it's actually true, and then everyone's like, oh, we knew it was true, or something like that. So it's sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of too bad, but it is what it is, and so we made that proposal. But those are kind of the hypotheses that I'm looking at right now, and trying to study.
That's
Uh,
awesome and fascinating and exciting. Yeah, I'd love to be able to see the science behind that, because I would say I'm sensitive to the vibration and sound in general. Like if there's more than one conversation going on at once, it's like chaos in my brain. But if I have one frequency, one tone to focus on, it's like it literally just like washes over your whole body. And you can like,
yeah, right,
it's like
yeah.
clears your mind. It just like melts everything else away, and it really brings you into that present moment, and it's such a blissful state.
Right. So the question, I think a fundamental question is, what's going on? Um, at what level are at what level is your body resonating with the tone or frequency that's being transmitted,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are your like you would imagine that there's some aspect of some molecular vibration, right? Definitely probably an electron vibration, some molecular vibration to some degree. some more physical vibration in the fluids and the cells and the blood. Um, and and how is that then affecting you directly on a very, we'll just call it, um, physical and psychological realm, right? uh,
Mm-hmm.
so there are some theories out there, but again, they're theories, and I'd like to try to do the experiments to actually show them.
Yeah.
um, but a lot of it is based on funding, so we're looking for funding.
Yeah, I'd love to be a part of that someday. And if hopefully we can help get the word out there, and that would be amazing to be able to not only um I guess be able to prove, but also really just to see what is going on the inside, and how do
Yeah.
these frequencies impact our bodies. And I'm really curious, are like specific frequencies more beneficial to the body? Some may be harmful, and how do we find those optimal frequencies that are the most beneficial?
Exactly, exactly. So that, so um, I think sticking with the ones, initially it's sort of like, if we don't have the research, or the research money, it's like sticking to the ones that we know are beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
And the both light and sound frequencies that we know are beneficial,
Mm-hmm.
and combining them, um, and trying to get sort of first person reports or case studies out there of people that have gone through light and sound treatments. And then, hopefully people get more interested in it, and there's more funding, and then the larger studies can be done. So I think it's just going to be, it's just going to be time and effort that will come in. But I do believe, hopefully, we're kind of moving in that direction. That's kind of what I see.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely get the sense that it is the future of medicine. Like there's a frequency for, if every disease operates on a specific frequency, then there's a frequency that can combat that.
Exactly.
And can we use those together and to harmonize the body back to homeostasis, like you said?
Exactly.
But I'm so fascinated by the work that you're doing with the cerebrospinal fluid. How did you get into that?
It actually came from getting body work done, uh, and feeling it. So it's totally authentically driven. I was in medical school, and my now wife, asked me to take some time off of medical school and go study healing arts. And at first I was very resistant because I was in medical school and just kind of wanted to finish. But then she convinced me, and we went to Santa Fe and did some studying of hands-on healing arts. And as part of the studies, we would get sessions. And some of those sessions were in craniosacral therapy, and all they would do is essentially, all they would do, they would hold my occiput. So I was just lying on like a massage table, and they were holding my occiput, and I was a skeptic, of course. I was in med school, so I sort of felt like, everything had to be on the physical realm. And then, somebody was essentially holding my occiput and just
What
holding a very,
what is occiput? Can you define that?
oh, it's just your head.
Okay.
But
Okay.
they're kind of holding it. Like if you're lying down, they put their hands like under. So these are like back here, these are like the occipital bones back here.
Okay.
Um, so you're sort of holding the occiput like this, as opposed to maybe holding the frontal bone here. But I mean, you can hold, but what I'm describing is, how it came. They were simply just putting their hands. So I was lying on a table, and they just slid their hands under my head. So if you imagine my head here, so my occipital bones would be laying on their hands.
Okay.
Um, and I just felt this. After a few sessions, I sort of started feeling this pulsatile energy that was gathering in the middle of my brain. And after the first time this happened, uh, it I was, because I was in med school, I was trying to sort of like visualize the anatomy of it, and then also trying to understand what the mechanism of it was. And so what I did, the first thing I thought was, oh, I'm let's say my perception is slightly increasing and I'm just noticing my breath. And so I'd pay attention to my breath, or I'd put my hand on my chest going up and down, and it had a different rhythm than my breathing. And so then I
Mm.
thought, oh, well, then it's the heart rate, right? Like I was just thinking of like things that had a rhythm, had a pulse. And so I just, I was getting the session and I just sort of grabbed my radial artery and checked that. And that was going at a completely different rhythm than this sort of like felt like a coalescing, sort of like a coalescing pulsation in the middle of my head. And so those were the first two things I thought. And if there was any cerebral blood pumping, it would probably be correlated with my heart rate. And there was no correlation at all. It was completely different. And so, that was the first time it happened. And then I said, okay, well, it's kind of neat, kind of like one of those like experiential experiences, right? Just kind of like, all right, I think I went home and I told my wife, I was like, yeah, this is how it felt like. And it seemed like there was a large, like if you close your eyes and you visualize, even when we have our eyes closed, we still can see something. All of a sudden, it's like if you were to draw what I saw, it seemed like it was a huge eye. So it's just a big eye, like
Okay.
one eye, right? Not the letter I, but like what we use to see.
Uh-huh.
And it was just one big eye. And I was like, oh, it's kind of cool. I told my wife, right? Or we were dating at the time. Now she's my wife. Um, and then what happened is that so we get these repeated sessions, and it happened every single time. So
Wow.
it was very reproducible, and it still is. And so then I started working with it and just sort of like, again, being curious about it. Like, oh, what is it? If I open my eyes, it seems to disappear from this view, but there's still this felt sense of this pulsation that was occurring. It felt as if the energy could, like, as if you could build it, like accentuate it in a way or enhance
Okay.
it. Um, and and yet and it felt like you could decrease it if necessary. So it's sort of like I was learning how to have this relationship with it, and almost like a little dance in a way. And um and it happened essentially every time, and I got very interested in it because I'm like, it's just curious to me that you can get these body work sessions and this happens, right? And so it kept on happening more and more. And then I felt like more of like an energy sort of rising up from the spine, and I became very interested in also then sort of seeing, could I feel it and what was it? And anatomically, when I visualized it anatomically or really went into the body to feel it as a sensation, where that sensation was localized to me, where it was localized was actually in this space in the middle of the brain called the third ventricle.
Okay.
So it's just the space in the middle of the brain that's filled with fluid, and I have no idea why. I didn't do any studying on it. It's not like I was like, oh, there's something in the third ventricle. Now let me see if I can feel it. It was sort of like this is happening. Where is it anatomically? If I was to locate it anatomically as a felt sense of this pulsatile nature, what is that? And I was like, oh, that feels like the third ventricle. But the only reason I knew that is because I was in med school and we had, hardcore anatomy classes, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's like I could localize it and then be like, oh, well, if it's the third ventricle, then it must be connected to the lateral ventricles, and then it must be connected to the fourth ventricle. And so then, like anatomically, it was almost as if I could start uh, playing with it.
Wow.
And it was kind of guiding me, right? I could sort of, it's almost as if, because I had a really good sense of the anatomy, I could imagine myself, in essence, not myself, but like my attention. It's almost
Mm-hmm.
as if I could place my attention
Mm-hmm.
in my third ventricle and be like, okay, here I am, right? And then, and kind of almost as if you're navigating a new realm. And so that sort of took me into, some kind of personal journeys of, and then I just, I was like, wow, this is the cerebrospinal fluid. And then I started doing research on it, essentially. Uh, but I went back to Harvard to do the research, and so it had to, it was very scientific. So sort of like, the first question was sort of, what does this fluid even do?
Right.
Um,
My
we
first question.
Yeah, we had very little knowledge of this fluid, of what it actually did. And now it's like sort of the research in the cerebrospinal fluid world has just taken off because of various findings that have come from it. But the first question is sort of, well, if you want to know what something does, then maybe we should figure out the contents of it, right? So we started doing studies of like looking in the contents of the fluid and seeing, could we determine what the fluid actually does? And then anatomically, the fluid is bathing during the embryo, it's bathing all the stem cells, every stem cell of the nervous system, it's bathing. And then the stem cells actually leave the cerebrospinal fluid, the contact with the cerebrospinal fluid, and become neurons to develop the brain. And so there was this sort of like capacity of the cerebrospinal fluid to maintain neuronal stem cells. And so we did a whole bunch of sort of studies, and that was the work of my PhD, was essentially doing a whole bunch of studies trying to understand what this fluid actually did developmentally.
Wow.
And how much it changed and things like that. And those are all published, and people can read them if they want. And then I was working with a wonderful postdoc who now has a lab at Harvard, who continues to do research on the cerebrospinal fluid, and has even done research on the amniotic fluid and the transition from the amniotic fluid to the cerebrospinal fluid. And then looking at conditions such as like hydrocephalus, when you're born with like or when you develop too much fluid in the brain and you don't absorb it well enough, or things like that. So she's gone off and has a wonderful career um, um, looking at various parts of brain development, but really kind of taking off on the cerebrospinal fluid. And then other people looking at the cerebrospinal fluid and seeing just what it actually does. And so, the biggest research that has come out from the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years is essentially that so the research shows that when we sleep, our brain gets flushed with cerebrospinal fluid. So the brain tissue itself actually gets flushed with cerebrospinal fluid.
Wow.
And before, we kind of thought, not really, but we kind of thought that their cerebrospinal fluid was sort of held within these cavities of the brain, and there wasn't much mixture between what we call the intracellular or the intracellular fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid, because there was a separation, and sort of the cerebrospinal fluid was in the cavities. But what we saw is that the cerebrospinal fluid actually goes into the brain tissue and sort of flushes. It's sort of like you get like a flash of cerebrospinal fluid going through the brain tissue. during sleep. And this was one of the first findings of sort of like, wow, physiologically, when we sleep, something really dramatic is actually happening in the brain. And what that flush of fluid does essentially is it cleans out the brain. So it's sort of used as a as a as it removes any toxins that build up during the day, just natural toxins. If you don't get good sleep, you don't get this flush of cerebrospinal fluid, and then the toxins build up. Well, there's some evidence. I've been saying this for 4 or 5 years. They haven't done the studies yet, but there is some evidence to suggest that any parasympathetic state may actually cause this same
Mm.
function. So deep meditation, um, body work where you're going into a really restful place.
Mm.
When I say parasympathetic, what I mean is sort of the rest and digest. It's part of the autonomic nervous system. So it's sort of the balance of the sympathetic, the stress, the fight and flight nervous system. So in a parasympathetic state, when you're resting and you're digesting your food, that the cerebrospinal fluid may actually be able to penetrate the brain and the spinal cord and the brain tissues and sort of clean it out. And that's my hypothesis, is that it's
Wow.
not doesn't only happen during sleep, it also can happen during deep states of meditation and whatnot. And so you get this sort of like, imagine like your brain was like the shore of a continent, and the cerebrospinal fluid was like the ocean. And every night the tide comes in and it washes the shore, right? So it comes in and whoosh, and it goes up a little bit, right? And then when you wake up, you're nice and clean, and everything's taken away by the cerebrospinal fluid back, and you either poop it out or pee it out, and then your brain is clean and you feel good, right? You feel refreshed,
Mm.
um, and so that's really neat. Right. And so then you have to ask, right? Well, here's this pulsatile nature, right, that occurs. So we're talking about pulsatile nature, right, with music and light and all this other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's this pulsatile nature that occurs when we're in sleep, that there's something that happens to the brain tissue that opens up in a parasympathetic sleep state. And the fluid can go in more readily. So then, what other things can cause a sort of a pulsatile nature, right? So we already talked about, what are some of the other things? Well, what the research has shown, I'm just talking specifically, what they've actually been able to measure,
Okay.
is our breath. So breathing actually can cause our cerebrospinal fluid to move.
Mm.
And so if you take a deep inhale, you are bringing cerebrospinal fluid up into your third ventricle. So by inhaling, you're bringing your cerebrospinal fluid into your third ventricle. And now you'll actually hear people like Wim Hof, or people who teach sort of different breathing techniques, take a deep inhale, bring that fluid up into your third ventricle, into your brain, right? And on an exhale, what happens is that the studies have shown that on an exhale, from like your belly button on down, or maybe mid belly area on down, the fluid actually gets pushed down to the sacrum. So the fluid actually goes down to the sacrum from your belly button on down on an exhale, right? So imagine, right, that we're in a closed system, your sacrum being a vessel of cerebrospinal fluid, sort of like a lake,
Okay.
and your head also being like another lake with separated by these little ventricles and stuff like that. But if you're in a bathtub, right? So now imagine that you're kind of in a bathtub, and if the warm water is by your feet and you're trying to get the warm water up to your neck, well, you could go down and sort of bring the warm water up, right? And that would be breathing in, taking a deep inhale, right? Or you could imagine that, I'm kind of lazy right now. I'm just gonna, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna use my feet, right? And I'm gonna push the water to the wall of the bath. the water is going to hit the wall of the bath, and then what is it going to do? It's going to actually come up,
Hmm.
right? So if I push the water one way, it hits the wall and then it comes up. And so if you could imagine, right, now you breathe out, and from your navel on down, you're pushing the fluid down into your sacrum. So it goes down into your sacrum, but it stops at your sacrum. So you're kind of energizing your sacrum a little bit, right? You're energizing what's in the sacrum. You're kind of pushing it, hey, and then you take a big breath in, and now you're bringing it all the way up, and then you do it again. And so from your mid belly down, you push it down into your sacrum, and then you bring it in, down and in, and down and in. And in the middle of this, what you could do is you can add like a Kegel exercise, or like in yoga, they call them bandhas, and you essentially do a Kegel exercise where you constrict your perineal floor, and now you're actually using some muscular activity to constrict the perineal floor, right? So you're constricting your perineal floor. That then is a pump. You constrict the bottom, and now it comes up as you're inhaling. Right? So you constrict the perineal floor as you inhale, then you release your perineal floor, you push it down, exhale, and then you constrict your perineal floor and you bring it up. And so now you can almost see it starting sort of like a cycle, right? And so you can get that. So you can kind of do this breath work and create a pulsation, an internal pulsation of the cerebrospinal fluid that's going in. That's, as it breathes in, it actually goes, and it, sort of causing waves on the inside of our brain, literally affecting the brain tissue. Quite amazing, right? Quite fantastic.
Absolutely.
And so now, right? So now link, right, whatever it might be, link the work that people have done for millennia with breathing, and now we're doing a lot more research on breathing, but also with this concept of, oh wow, we're really actually amplifying the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid. We're getting it into our third ventricle. If we go into a parasympathetic state, it might actually be going into our brain itself, cleaning things out. But the question is, well, what pulsation, right? What pulsation can you actually create internal that is sort of like, it's like the music of the cerebrospinal fluid, for instance, that you're creating based on your breath, based on bringing in humming sounds, right? Music that you could create, that as the vibrations come from your neck or your vocal cords, actually create affect the cerebrospinal fluid that are in the back of your head, or that's coming up through your spine. And so I think all those things are really interesting. And people are starting to kind of see the benefits of breath work, the benefits of sleep, and now we're tying it into what is happening to the cerebrospinal fluid when we do breath work, or when we do sleep, or when we do all these other things. And when we expose ourselves to light or sound or any of these things, the hard part is that the imaging, is still very difficult to capture, like small changes in vibration. We can capture relatively large changes in fluid flow, right? So the large movements of the cerebrospinal fluid, the small pulsations against the wall of the brain is more difficult to actually study with the imaging we have now, which is why the research that we proposed was actually doing these studies in people who unfortunately were sick and were in the neuro ICU and had a shunt, had actually a catheter that was placed in their cerebrospinal fluid to monitor the pressure.
Okay.
That's the way that we would get these subtle pulsations, right?
Sure.
And so I'm still working on kind of getting the IRB and the funding for that. But even doing it on an N of 1 and showing that and seeing some sort of change, I think would be quite quite interesting to a lot of different people. Um, so you can see how kind of like, breath work, um, and energy and frequency, because when we're doing breath work, we're creating a frequency, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that frequency then is informing the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid then is informing the brain to some degree. And we want to see, what does that change in frequency actually do to the brain on a physiologic level.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's
that's a lot. I don't
fascinating. Yeah,
know.
that's fascinating stuff. I'm super curious about the answers to all of those questions.
I mean, it is interesting. There's a gentleman. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he's at the University of Pisa, and he's done a lot of great work on breath work. And he's actually proposed a hypothesis, and was looking into possibly the cerebrospinal fluid as being a mechanism for the transmission of that information. But for instance, when you breathe with your nose, that there's these added benefits with breathing through your nose, and especially there seems like there's greater synchrony between different areas of the brain when we breathe with our nose, and it
Really?
seems to be that when we breathe through our nose, the air goes up our nasal passages and it actually hits our olfactory bulb, which is like right here back. And the
Okay.
olfactory bulb comes out of the cribriform plate. And the cribriform plate is a bone-like structure, but it has these holes in it where the olfactory bulb actually comes out. And that's how we smell, right? If I take peppermint essential oil and I do this, right, I can smell the odor because there's nerve receptors, there's nerves that come out of my brain essentially and go through the cribriform plate, and those molecules go in and they bind in the receptors, and then they send that information to my brain, and I can say, oh, this smells like peppermint.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we breathe with our nose, every time the air hits our olfactory bulb, there's a little resonance. And so when what he found is that the resonance, simply the vibration on the olfactory bulb itself, creates a resonance, actually sends sort of a resonance signal into our brain and creates this sort of greater synchrony and cohesiveness within the brain. And so he was trying to understand, how does that actually occur? Because it was very quick. It happened very quickly. Sort of like the nerve here was sensing a resonance based on that's one, that's two, right? Uh, and then my brain would actually get more cohesive in terms of the areas of the brains that it was functioning on. So very fascinating. So like, not only are we trying to do the research ourselves, but we're also following it and kind of piecing it together very holistically, to try to offer any sort of let's say healing modality to people, because I work with patients who have chronic pain, and see how can we actually try to help these people.
Yeah, that's amazing. Very cool. I'm curious if you've seen any connection with Kundalini energy that people talk about, because that's kind of explained as like an energy rising. How do you correlate that with cerebrospinal fluid, or is there one?
Yeah, so I mean, my correlation with it is that the energy actually, um, if there's like an all-pervading, let's say, energy field, that in terms of it informing the physical body, that it actually enters through the fluid body.
Okay.
So the first step down process, let's say, from any like absolute energy, would be through the fluid, and then through the fluid, then it gets stepped down more into the more dense tissues. And so from my perspective, it's actually going through the fluid body that you can have, that it sort of creates a bridge um, it's a two to me. It's sort of a two-way bridge to sort of unmanifested potential energy, and whether it's that Kundalini or whatever that is, um, that as that energy is coming, that it actually steps down into the cerebrospinal fluid or the fluid in the body. But since the cerebrospinal fluid is essentially 99% water, that's like a perfect place for it to come down into and sort of materialize or manifest. And so I think there's a direct correlation. In my opinion, the cerebrospinal fluid is the conduit, the physical carrier of of what people call the Kundalini energy.
Okay.
And
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, it's just, and so now you open it up to people who have had the experience, and it's like, uh, many people describe it as, arising from the spine. People have described it as, bubbling, sort of opening up a can of, or a bottle of bubbling water, feeling the energy rise from the spine, coming up from the sacrum, rise in the spine. And the majority of people don't really have any anatomical basis of it. It's just that's where it feels like, and then it goes up and it goes to the crown or the head, and then when they hear my talks, or when they're like, oh my goodness, he's actually putting an anatomy to this. And so I that's what I think, and I think it's we should probably do a study on like correlating the anatomy with people's experience of it. But you know but at this point, that's sort of my hypothesis, and there's nothing that's coming in that would like change it at this point. But I'm always happy to change hypotheses as new research comes out, or as new things come out. No problem with it.
That's
But no, I
awesome.
think you're spot on. And so that's kind of like, so can you then activate the Kundalini on your own? Well, yeah, I believe you can. It's essentially just an energy. And so can you activate an energy on your own? Yes, you can. And so how would you do that, right? So breathing, right? Number
Mm-hmm.
one, movement, dance, yoga, right? Sound.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like I remember one of the first crystal bowls I experienced, I was on the table, right? And they put it right between my legs. Um, and played it, right, and then so the sound is coming, so there's like, and I felt it, right, you feel the vibrations, and it transmits an energy.
Mm-hmm.
So sleep, obviously, there's various things that that can stimulate it if people want to stimulate it. People sometimes want to stimulate it and then regret stimulating it, which is why, like, I've been working with the Emerging Sciences Foundation, to actually we created a 24 session, or lesson plan. Actually, it's called Awakening Awareness, which helps take people through, like, if you want to actually try to activate the Kundalini, what are some of the basic foundational sort of meditation or mindfulness techniques that you kind of should have under your belt before you try to activate it. Because I think it's good to just, to be able to uh, feel subtly. I think it's good to be able to sort of be able to name an emotion or a sensation that arises and not get too caught up with it, or have traumatic events that arise from it, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or if they do, to know what to do with them, because the majority of people aren't going to be doing this with like another with another therapist or counselor, or
Yeah.
guide. Let's say they're going to be doing it on their own. So it's sort of like, here's the foundation, right? Have this foundation, and now go and have fun and experiment.
Yeah. So you have an awesome library of free YouTube videos that I was beginning to check out on mindfulness, and that there's so much good content there. So you can get there through your website, which I love the name of, www.holdingspace.com.
Yeah, thanks.
How did you come up with that name? Like, what does that mean to you?
Oh, it was actually many years ago. It was while I was studying craniosacral therapy. And, at the end of the day, I was in bed one night, and I was just thinking, like, what are we doing for each other? What is this energy doing for me? Um, and it was sort of like, oh, it's just you're really you're really holding space for anything to emerge. And that's sort of like another way for me to look at like pure awareness, I guess, if you were to say, is total and unrestricted space, or so, through which everything emerges. And so there's no judger, there's no critiquer. It's just pure space. And in that space, um, that's where sort of love and creativity can emerge, and you can help co-create or create, or do whatever you want to do, I think. And so essentially it just came out of that, and I went online once and just said, oh, it's available, so I'm gonna grab it.
Cool.
But that was probably, what was it, 2008?
Okay.
Grab it.
Yeah,
So it's still
I like
still
that.
there.
Um, would you say it's possible to have like unhealthy cerebrospinal fluid? Or are
Yeah,
there things that you can do to make your fluid more full of
totally.
life?
It's just like anything, right? Diet is probably going to be the most important thing. Any fluid in the body is probably going to be affected by diet, types of medications.
Mm.
Um, my experience of COVID is that it uh, makes the fluid more dense. And so
Mm.
working with that density and making people recognize that there's an increased density from, maybe it's the inflammation or something like that. But a lot of it, what we're dealing with is a heightened inflammatory response, whatever that might be, through stress, through, work, through the food that we eat, the things that we drink, the lack of sleep that we have. And then it just builds up in the cerebrospinal fluid, and then we don't move. So the fluid's not moving, right? So just like any river, not only do you want the river to move, once it's stagnant, then that's actually when all the algae builds up and everything,
Mhm.
and the murkiness builds up. So if you can't change things, you know, if it's difficult because of your job or your stress or your sleep or anything like that, I would highly recommend doing, well, first of all, trying to decrease the amount of inflammation that's through your diet. There can be a lot of ways of doing that. We eat so much processed foods, or soft drinks or stuff like that. Just really trying to eat a whole food diet, things that come from nature, as close as possible. And then if you need to increase any sort of anti-inflammatory, component to it, turmeric is really great, to decrease inflammation. Cinnamon is really great to decrease inflammation. Boswellia or frankincense is really great to decrease inflammation. Omega 3s, or fish oils, or consuming healthy fish, I guess, is a good way of decreasing inflammation. Um, and there are, some people would say, depending on what other medications there are some contraindications to those. So you'd want to, if you do want to take any supplements, to obviously talk to your healthcare provider.
Mm.
Um, but getting the fluid to flow, essentially, and decreasing inflammation would probably be the two biggest things. And so with that, it would be moving, like getting exercise, even just walking if you can, or if you're in a wheelchair and you can't walk, trying to do any exercise with your upper extremities. If you can't exercise with your lower, exercise with your lower extremities, whatever it is, any movement that you could do, or even just imagining the movement, um, can can be beneficial. And then breathing, like really getting that fluid to move and breathe. and breathing is sort of like, I would say, one of the best things to do. And I feel like what you do in that situation is you start the process of the flow.
Like really conscious breath.
Yeah.
Yeah. The way that I understood, I guess, energy when I was first learning sound healing is that it is most often very like dormant in the base of our spine because we are just there's so much fear and anxiety in our lives. And so when our like I came at it as like a root chakra, is if our root chakra is blocked, the energy is not flowing up. So once you're able to really overcome fear or realize where in your life you're letting fear drive your decisions, then that's when things started to open up for me. So in that experience, is it true that the cerebral spinal fluid is just dormant down there? Or am I misunderstanding that?
It can definitely be dormant. It is moving based on our heartbeat, based on, respirations and stuff like that. But the thing is you can, like, let's say it's flowing at, it's sort of like a little trickle.
Hmm.
You can actually make it into um, a waterfall,
Okay.
right? And you can modulate it depending on what you're looking for.
Hmm.
And that's the cool part is I'm always a fan of, like, how do you, here here's this here's this total potential sphere of total potentiality, manifesting, every moment to moment manifestation, and we actually have the dial on that flow, and it's a conscious relationship, and we can modulate it, or we can learn to modulate it. And I think that's really cool. And so, um, let's say it's a trickle. Hopefully, it's always moving to some degree. You're moving, maybe you're walking. Even if you're, even if you're going to the bathroom and you have to stop and a little kegel, like that'll actually probably move a little bit. Hopefully you're getting some amount of sleep, right? So you're changing your position, so gravity is working a little bit. But can you enhance it, right? Can you modulate it? Can you learn to have a relationship with it? And what happens is that either it starts moving, okay, and like you kind of said, it starts moving, so it kind of opens up the root chakra a little bit,
Hmm.
like go into the second chakra, and then you start feeling something that you've never felt before. And then what happens? A lot of times people just close it down. And so there's sort of this shut. You have the valve, right? You actually have the valve. And many people do this, right? And then let's say it goes from your second chakra to your third chakra, and then something else appears. Maybe a tightening in the solar plexus appears. What's that? And then
Hmm.
you actually go to your doctor and you say, I have this tightening, and say, oh, you must be anxious. What are we going to give you? We're going to give you benzodiazepines to decrease your anxiety. But it's actually the energy moving, right? And so that, to me, is the complicated part of it, is actually really understanding, is this the energy moving, or is this really some pathophysiology that needs to be medicated and treated, for instance?
Yeah.
And that's why we did the Emerging Sciences Foundation, the Awakening Awareness Program, because it's as this energy starts to move, right? You might feel, there might be sensations in your body that start to open up, or that start to actually constrict, or any new sensation that arises. And the question is, can we be with that? Can we open to it? Can we investigate it with curiosity, as
Hmm.
opposed to close down to it? Because if we
Hmm.
close down to it, right, if our heart is ready to explode with love, hopefully love can just come through and just explode everybody's heart, but that doesn't actually happen that way. A lot of times they're so closed and constricted and tight that the energy don't flow. And that when you feel a tiny bit, there's like a vulnerability that occurs. And in that vulnerability, you recognize, nope, can't go there. Stop.
Not safe.
Not safe. Well,
Yeah.
what's not safe, right? And
Mm.
so essentially teaching people how to be safe, teaching people how to like titrate or bring in a bit of like resonate with something that's safe and not safe at the same time, and then just increasing that sphere of awareness, consciously increasing that sphere of awareness, because it's already open. We're just sort of consciously making it so that we don't have these created walls, and then being able to actually move it, and then living in that, right, and being able to modulate it and saying, oh, for this experience, let's turn up the faucet. And then it becomes like you have the control of the water faucet on the outside of your home. You're like, I need a lot of water now. It's just flowing hard. And then you go, okay, we need a little trickle. Beep. But let's say the energy comes, right, and you're like, whoa, it's flowing. That then you're also okay with that, right? That there's a bit of surrender in the moment to moment occurrences of, well, this is unfolding right now, and so how am I okay with that? And learning how to do that. So that's actually a lot of that is actually covered in our 24 session awakening awareness program, which is also free online.
I love that. Yeah, and I love to hear a medical doctor talking about energy. Have you met resistance in this approach to the holistic, energetic body with your colleagues or other people in the field?
Not really, to be honest with you. I have not.
That's amazing.
And the truth of the matter is that the language I use I can use very medical language.
Okay.
And there's a lot of analogies that are very physical and anatomical, and it's almost like, I feel like the majority of the time it's like a miscommunication, I guess. That it's almost like you're saying the same thing or very close to the same thing, but it's just we don't have the language to communicate, and I think that's really actually kind of sad, to be honest with you, because we'd probably be in a much better place if there was just sort of like one language, and we weren't trying to like beat each other up and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, I found my way into pain management, which is a really interesting field because there's so many options, right? And so it's sort of like, well, what have you done in the past? Oh, you've done these 15 other things. And how have those gone? And it's like, they haven't worked. It's like, oh, well then, are you okay? Like, do you want to try something different? And it's not different. It's sort of like, it's like tapping into energy in a different language.
Yeah.
So for instance, a fairly common procedure in people that have low back pain and leg pain, for instance, what we call like neuropathy, going into their legs, is a spinal cord stimulator. Right. So what does a spinal cord stimulator do? A spinal cord stimulator, we actually take electrodes, take an electrical current, and essentially lay it in the cerebrospinal fluid on the spine. And then there's a little dial on the outside of the body, and we turn the dial up. And that shoots an electrical current to the spine. And that electrical current will essentially try to send a different message to the brain. What's the message that it's trying to send? Well, it's sending a very high frequency pulsation. And what is it doing? Well, the way that the neurons work, right, is that essentially neurons can only perceive certain information. They can't, it's very difficult for them to take in like everything, right? So what we're doing is essentially we're tricking the nervous system by me sending a very high frequency pulsation through a wire that's laying on the spine. Now, what information does the spine transmit up to the brain? It only really can perceive, the brain only gets the information from this high frequency input.
Hmm.
And so therefore it completely forgets the leg pain.
Wow.
Okay. So now I just explained to you a very complicated, right, spinal cord stimulator. Now I ask you, could there be a way to do that without sticking an electrode in? All we're doing is we're tricking the brain into what perception, what impulse is going up the spine.
Hmm.
That's it, right? So if you know the mechanism of it to some degree, you don't have to know it, now you're going, wow, this is a spinal cord stimulator. We're really just stimulating the spinal cord. And more of these therapies are going to come out in terms of like, how are we actually using energy or frequency waves to change the way that our brain or spinal cord has been set up or processing information based on all of our experience through our lifetime, right? So if you think of things like transcranial stimulation, for instance, stimulation of the brain, um, uh, uh, transcranial magnetic stimulation, um, all these sorts of different things. Ultrasound now. We're actually using ultrasound to affect, right, brain ultrasound, where we're in, what's that? Well, that's a certain wave frequency again, right? And we can, if we use MRI with ultrasound, we can actually localize the ultrasound wave to a very specific area. And that's the specific area that we want to try to alter. Okay. And so we're using this stuff. And so if somebody comes to me and they're like, oh, I'm using brain ultrasound, I'm like, fantastic, right? Do you think we could do the same thing with like guided meditation or sound, right? Sound waves and guided meditation?
Yeah.
And the answer is clearly yes. It's clearly yes. It's just that, we're not going to do the studies to figure that out until 40 years from now. But it's clearly yes.
Yeah.
And so therefore it just might take longer. Right. And so that's where this combination, for me, it's sort of like, oh, combination. It's like, oh yeah, we could do this and this, or, let's combine this and this, or let's, kind of like these combinatorial effects, and sort of like, when do you want the, how quickly do you need the change? And if we actually teach our kids how to do it, then we won't need to actually implement these dramatic changes, because they'll be modulating themselves from an early age, and so be able to kind of create their own pathways, right?
Amen.
And yeah, things are going to happen, right? Traumas are going to occur, whatever. But if we have a supportive network around them, then hopefully it might not embed itself so deeply, right? And so it's sort of like using the therapeutics at the right time, or having the right, psychological counseling at the right time, even in infancy or early childhood or early teenage years, right? Where it's like, where you're not waiting until you're 25 or 30 or 50, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, oh, wait, dad, mom, I just had this. Oh, let's rewire the brain, right? Okay, how do we want to do this? Let's process it through the body. Let's have the felt sense be. Let's bring you back out of that memory so that we don't develop PTSD. Let's bring you into the now, into the present moment, right? And so what are the tools that we're using? Well, we could be using light, sound, different types of medications. I won't go into those. Um, you know, transcranial stim, whatever it is, right? And it's sort of like
Hmm.
meditation, mindfulness,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
healing touch, whatever that might be. So
Yeah.
I don't know. That's
I,
just my 2 cents.
yeah, I'm a big believer that the quickest way to change the world is to get to the teach the kids how to be mindful and self-aware, because then they won't have to hopefully heal when they're 40.
Yeah, it'd be a
But
good study to do, right? Follow them.
yeah.
Have a class. I mean, I trained with somebody, and she just got hired at her school district to do she's now the welfare coach.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and they're doing things like, they're learning how to meditate, they're learning how to practice mindfulness, they're learning how to do um, um, relaxation response, they're learning how to do biofeedback and all this stuff, which is really cool stuff.
That's great. Yeah. I'm trying to get in the starting with the school my kids are in, but just trying to get the sound healing out there, mindfulness out there, because these kids, I don't know if they've ever really come like inside and really tuned into what's going on in their bodies. How could you ever even take in all the outside stimulus without knowing what's going on the inside? So I think it's a great place to start as well. But I did want to talk to you about the project you're working on with the cerebrospinal fluid I am presence. Can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of help you're looking for from others?
Mostly it's funding, to be honest. Uh, I mean, essentially, what we're trying to do is sort of it's very similar to the study that I already proposed, which is essentially, can we, can the cerebrospinal fluid be affected? Can we show that the cerebrospinal fluid can be affected from an external energy source? And the first one that we'd go to, because we already know that it has therapeutic value, would be some sort of sound healing, for instance. So somebody's in the ICU and they have a catheter that's in their ventricle, and we do sound healing. And to all the neurosurgeons that I've spoken with, it would be very easy to get consent from the family, because very few people would say, "Oh, I don't want you to play that sound to my son or daughter or mother or husband." Or whoever it is, family member. And so, because consent is important, but when you can't do consent, then you have to go through, it's still important to do all these studies ethically. And very few people would say, look, we're going to play, 128 hertz sound. And what we'd like to do is, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to play it on the outside. The sound has been used for millennia. It hasn't had any effect on, yada, yada, yada. And what we want to do is, because they have a catheter in their brain already, we're actually going to see if we can notice any wave changes in that catheter, right? And just seeing then, and then if we see the wave changes in the catheter, there's a neuroscientist who I'm working with, who would want to study the entropy of the fluid itself as we are bathing it with, or bathing the whole room that they're in with sound. And then seeing if we can see EEG changes in the brain, essentially. And differentiating those changes from changes that are occurring through the olfactory, through the auditory canal. And so, can we differentiate? Because there may be, right, you're expecting some changes coming in from the auditory canals, and so therefore, can we actually determine the changes that are actually coming from a change in vibration of the cerebrospinal fluid to the EEG to the brain tissue from playing some sort of acoustic sound, drum, Tibetan bowl, crystal bowl, etc. And so we're looking for funding for that. We already have the everything is essentially set up except for the funding. But essentially what I try to do is just bring awareness to the cerebrospinal fluid. So, doing any, if you're in any meditation or you're doing any classes, kind of getting a sense of the anatomy of the cerebrospinal fluid and just bringing your awareness to it. And that's it. And saying, wow, I have a clear fluid that's bathing the inside of my brain, that's filling these ventricles. What could it be doing? And just kind of open yourself up to that fluid that's there, and then see what happens. And on my website I have stories of people who have done this and who write in, who feel comfortable enough to write in and explain their stories. And so we're just kind of collecting people's experiences of, hey, when I did this is what happened, or this is what I felt. Or a lot of people send me near-death experiences via email, and they never make it on the website, but it's all via email. And they send me near-death experiences, and then they talk about some incredible experience that they had with their cerebrospinal fluid. And so what I'm hoping to do is sort of, it might be harder than, because I have so many now, is getting permission from everybody to publish these, because I think it'd be a fascinating little compendium of stories that people have, and nothing scientific, but just hey, these are individual people's accounts of their experience, right? It'd almost be like taking like 100, give me a story of 100 women going through childbirth, right? Many are gonna be different, some aspects are gonna be similar, but it kind of be interesting to know, right, across the globe, right? And so I think when you do this on a level like this, that you're gonna get, I get people from Australia, New Zealand, India, China. I have one person asking me if they can, they're like, we want to get your stuff to this person in China, but YouTube is blocked or something like that. And so, so there's nothing like special about it. It's just, tell me your experience. And sort of creating like an experiential library of it.
I love it. Very cool. When I do my guided meditation with a sound bath and my crystal singing bowls, basically bringing awareness to that root chakra, and then connecting with the earth, and then bringing up that energy from the earth all the way through the chakras up to source, creator, and then back down. And my experience is that I kind of, what I call it is like that, and I heard in one of your meditations, it's like that liquid plasma light that's like a fountain just pouring through. When you tune into that, and like allow it to come in, it's like a fountain pouring in and through. And then it's like we as a conduit become just a channel for this energy to flow up and down through us. So I'm like, that's like my mission, is like connect people to plugging in to this source and earth. And it's like an activation, it seems. So it's so neat to hear you explain it in a medical way. So I'm so thankful for all that you've shared and all the research that you're doing. And I hope and pray that your study gets funded, because I can't wait to see the information that comes out because of it.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, what you're doing, connecting that way is absolutely incredible. So keep doing that.
I will. And same to you. Thank you so much for being on the Frequency Matters podcast. And I hope that we can stay in touch, and I'd love to follow along on your work and your journey.
Cool. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye. This concludes the Frequency Matters podcast, episode 4. Thank you so much for tuning in today and listening into the fascinating conversation with Dr. Mauro Zapaterra. He can be found through his website, www.holdingspace.com, and you can link to his YouTube channel with his amazing resource of awakening library of YouTube videos, 24 episodes of content and practices, and it's really fascinating stuff, and I hope that you'll explore all the information that's out there. Thanks again. Have a blessed and beautiful day. Frequency matters.